Hey guys, it's Daniel. Welcome back.
Mark Lanigan was one of the key figures of the grunge scene and a very close friend of Kurt Cobain's. In 2020, Mark Lanigan released his memoir, Sing Backwards and Weep. This memoir has been hailed by many as an extremely blunt and moving account of Mark Lanigan's life. Of the many poignant subjects he touches upon in this book, one of them is the death of his close friend, Kurt Cobain. In an interview for Rolling Stone, journalist Corey Groh asked Mark Lanigan the following question, quote, "You wrote that you have a deep regret for your actions around his death because he'd called you that day and you didn't return his calls. How did you process his death?" The following is Mark Lanigan's response. This article for Rolling Stone was published on April 23, 2020. Quote, "When a drug addict loses a friend, they just do more drugs. I moved forward by sticking with the people that I knew, Dylan Carlson and my best friend in Seattle, Lane Staley, and we continued to do what we always did. But now we were missing a huge piece of our lives. Logic would tell you that when a friend of yours dies the way that Cobain did, it would make you wise up and say, oh crap man, do I want to end up like this too? But instead, what a drug addict does is they just do more drugs and cry in their beer. Kurt's death just made me go deeper and deeper, just wanting to disappear and forget that I had what started as this really pure relationship of mutual admiration with Kurt for each other's music, which we had for years. We liked the same kind of music, and then that warped into a situation where he had become so famous that he said to me at one point, "You and Dylan are the only real friends I have anymore," at the height of his popularity, and it was really just sad. I also remember thinking, what kind of friend am I? Because this guy used to look up to me, and he always acted as though he did look up to me still, even though I knew he saw my decline. I just remember thinking, wow, I could have shown some decent guidance here to help this kid who looked up to me and who I loved. And instead, I was just a guy who became one of those people that would go out and buy drugs for his more famous friends who couldn't go out in public. That was hard to reconcile, and it always will be. I could have been a different person, but I wasn't. Kurt and I were really close before he became famous. Funny enough, I was actually the famous one in our relationship for a number of years. He had a natural talent. I knew that from the moment I saw him singing in the Ellensburg Public Library, in a tiny town I grew up in. Dylan Carlson had asked me to go see his friend Kurt's band play there because Kurt was a fan of mine. And that's how I met Kurt, as a fan of mine. He looked up to me sort of like a big brother, but I knew this guy had something magical. It took a while, but obviously, the world recognized his talent at some point, and we all know what happened with that. End quote. Mark Lanigan and Nirvana have shared history with one another, particularly the Jury Project in 1989, where Mark Lanigan and Mark Pickerel of the Screaming Trees recorded 4 songs together with Kurt and Chris, most notably a rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, which was released on Mark Lanigan's debut solo record in 1990, The Winding Sheet. The Jury sessions took place in August of 1989. A few months earlier, on April 14th, 89, Nirvana played a show in Mark Lanigan's hometown of Ellensburg, Washington, a small city about 2 hours southeast of Seattle. The show made a big impression on Mark Lanigan, who once recalled the following, quote, "In the spring of 89, Nirvana played a show at the community center in my hometown of Ellensburg, Washington. They completely blew me away. It was like seeing The Who in their prime. After 2 songs, some guy who worked there stopped the show. Nirvana had gone over their time limit because the local bands who had opened had gone over time. So they just stood there for a second, and then Chris started throwing his bass in the air, up to the top of this 20-foot ceiling and catching it with one hand. Meanwhile, Kurt was letting his amp go as loud as heck, and their road manager got into a fist fight with the guy who stopped the show. The whole thing was completely crazed, and this was in Ellensburg of all places. I still believe to this day, Nirvana's the best band I've ever seen." End quote. Mark Lanigan and Kurt Cobain are of course 2 of the marquee figures of the grunge scene, and according to Mark Pickerel, the 2 of them had a mutual respect for one another. The following is a quote from Mark Pickerel, quote, "I know that Kurt was a big fan of Lanigan's. They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, But at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums on a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of to be the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but be really the band leader. He is just a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Christ. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanigan's talents and vision." End quote. As mentioned earlier in the first Mark Lanigan quote that I read, according to Mark Lanigan himself, Mark's best friend was Lane Staley of Alice in Chains. The following is a quote where Mark Lanigan talks about the death of Lane Staley and how he compares Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain to one another, how their two deaths affected him differently. Quote, "Out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Lane Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, 'Hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, 'No, you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago.' His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, 'I always just keep thinking I'm gonna get that same feeling I got the first time again.' And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was gonna happen. Although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Lane, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Lane was like a twin." End quote. Now, of course, when it comes to Kurt Cobain and Mark Lanigan, and in a broader sense, Nirvana and the Screaming Trees, there are multiple connections between the two bands. One of those connections is producer Steve Fisk, who worked with both Nirvana and the Screaming Trees. I've done a couple of interviews with Steve over the years. The first one was about Nirvana, and the second was about the Trees. I want to show you a clip now from my interview with Steve about the Screaming Trees, where he touches on Mark Lanigan. Later in this video, I'll be exploring more details about Mark Lanigan's relationship with Kurt Cobain, including a quote from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickrell, where, according to Mark, Kurt Cobain was actually intimidated by Mark Lanigan, at least initially. I'll be exploring that and more later on. But first, the Steve Fisk clip. If you want to see the full interview with Steve, the link is available below. All the interviews on my channel are original. I'm the one putting them all together by myself. If you want to support, the best way to do so is to subscribe, share, and like. So what was it like working with Mark Lanigan as a vocalist?
Well, I think the longer he sang, the more he figured out what he could do with that bass register, a low tenor thing. That's kind of his signature now.
Did you ever double his voice?
A lot of the time, yeah. He chewed tobacco.
As he was singing?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
It was always hard to make his voice read against all those guitar overdubs. Mark learned the hard way that if you leave Lee on his own, he'll just do guitar overdubs. By the time we got to mixing the Invisible Lantern record, Mark was like, what? Like, no.
That's funny.
He was at home in his low octave, which hadn't really blossomed yet. Mark Lanigan, as we know him now, you can start to hear, that thing kind of jump out where the screams all land, and when he goes for a big note, he's got the right lyric and the right turn and the right push behind it. There was a couple of moments where I went like, oh shit, he's really turning into something really wonderful, and he was always good, and he was always lyric and melodic. If he wasn't happy, then the whole vibe got just, then there was no vibe, and you were just trying to make Mark happy. But Mark was also in a lot of physical pain, and he had really bad headaches, and he was totally sober the whole time. It's none of my fucking business, but when you're making a complete, commitment to doing psychedelic records, I was the only guy that smoked pot. Nobody smoked pot. A couple of guys in the band drank a little bit, but Mark was serious about doing it. I mean, and we went through a kind of a sound search on his voice and played with different kinds of compression and turning off compression. So no, there was a whole very concerted effort. We started with this Neumann because it was the best, that KM84 I was telling you about earlier. And I think that's the vocal mic on Other Worlds and Clairvoyance, and eventually we switched over to an SM58, which is kind of a pedestrian microphone, but it's a great microphone to scream into. I know you had a whole video about Kurt Cobain screaming in microphones and all of that. But, Mudhoney, we're using SM58s. Everybody's using SM58s, so we just quit fucking around with trying to do something high quality or fancy and just use an SM58. So, Invisible Lantern and even if and especially when we're just, Mark singing into a mic on a stand. One of the other things you got to think about too is when you're having 8-track, that means at a certain point you have to erase the scratch vocal. There's no way to save the scratch vocal. And even though the sound was shitty and there was tons of bleed, Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals were so good. And I would try to talk him out of it, but there wasn't like any fancy digital thing where you could bounce it off someplace with the idea that eventually you'd figure out some way to use it or something like that. And it didn't sound anything like a real vocal because it had guitars and cymbals and everything in it. But Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals, he delivered on every fucking take. There wasn't a scratch vocal that wasn't as good as it could get. As somebody who later really learned how to recognize a good take, the idea that there aren't any live Mark Lanigan takes from that whole period of our work with him, I'm just embarrassed. That's just stupid. But that's just the reality of it. And then it's also that's working with an artist and understanding there's no way I'm putting that vocal out.
I hear you. So I mean,
erase it.
So would he be the kind of person that he would sing like 15-20 minutes, take a break, and come back, or would he be one of the guys that would go for like 2 hours straight? Like what was he like in that regard?
I think we had evenings where we just sang vocals, 4 hours of singing, 3 hours of singing. It was just like at a certain point, there was just sort of a workman, thing. We're like, all right, we've done all the guitars, let's do all the vocals. I didn't know anything about different kinds of singers. I hadn't learned fuck, so I learned a lot about recording vocals working with Lanigan, and I think we tried all kinds of things, Remember there was one song, I forgot which one it was. I'm pretty sure it was an Invisible Lantern song where Mark didn't want to finish it or didn't want to finish writing the words or something. Forget what the thing was. And he made like a whole party out of it where it says, okay, Rod Doak, the same thing. You go sing it now. Okay, Lee, you sing it now. And Lee would go out and do his version of it. And we make a mix of that. And it says, okay, Fisk, you go out and sing it now. So there's this one song that's got, and there's this cassette of it somewhere. Maybe it's gone by now, but it's just me doing all these rough mixes of like these, everybody in the studio sang the song because Mark was just having fun, kind of not finishing the vocal.
That's funny. So in general, like how many takes would you get for his vocals? Like would you do a lot of takes or just not that many?
It seemed to go well. He was never like, hey, I just nailed that. He's not that kind of guy. So even when it was great, he still had all kinds of misgivings, but he could walk away from it going, that's as good as it's going to get tonight. Neither of us knew what we were doing. We figured out the SM58, and I think there was an old Symmetrix 522 compressor. He just did a great job of figuring out his shit, and it was by, a lot of learn by, by doing kind of thing, so he did a lot of shit was good enough, but, for him, he's got a kind of a relentless thing about perfection and all of that. So I think that drove him to, do all this other, God, it's really inaccurate, really, really badly worded. But, what he turned into was because he wasn't happy with what he was. And without getting into the book, but the idea that he was saddled with doing this kind of genre music, the psychedelic thing, it's like he loved it and he dug it, but like all the Screaming Trees, he listened to tons of music. So the idea that he doesn't want to talk about, the old stuff or play the old songs or anything like that, I mean, that makes complete sense. It was where he landed, it's how he got started, but, I don't think it was his first love.
Yeah, fair enough.
And in a small town, there's not another band, so I think, he loved all these guys, but, wasn't necessarily, a good fit from the beginning, And then you go to Seattle, and then you're in the goddamn 90s, and you're from Eastern Washington, so you're not part of, the UW hipster thing or the North End metal thing or any of this shit. So they're outsiders in the middle of this thing that's incredibly political and high pressure and weird, and surprised they got to be friends with Nirvana. Also the Hicks from the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Maybe that's why they connected,
Yeah.
The following is from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickerel, where he discusses Kurt Cobain's admiration for Screaming Trees singer Mark Lanigan. Quote, "They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, but at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums for a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but really be the band leader. He just is a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Chris. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanigan's talents and vision." End quote. This supergroup that Mark Pickerel is referring to, of course, would be known as the Jury. On August 20th and 28th, 1989, the band recorded 4 tracks with producer Jack Endino, including a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Later in this video, I'm going to show you a clip from one of my interviews with Jack Endino where he reflects on this, but first I'm going to share with you a quote from Mark Pickerel where he discusses how the project came together. Quote, "We were all becoming big blues fans during a similar point in time. I think Lanigan approached me with it because he knew that I was already a big Leadbelly fan, and just a blues fan in general. And since Kurt and Chris were both becoming fans of the same genre, we thought it'd be cool to be the first band out of the Northwest that already had some notoriety to try and forge ahead with a different sound, or a different vision. I believe we learned a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night from a cassette that I had. I think Kurt brought a cassette version of Ain't It a Shame. Grey Goose may have been Lanigan. I think we started exclusively with Leadbelly, and then we were going to branch out from there. The original idea was just to do a session devoted to Leadbelly, and then go back in later on and do some other blues artists as well. Mark's vocals with Kurt's vocals could have led to something really powerful, I think, but the irony is, it was that combination of those two personalities that slowed things down. They were like junior high kids at a dance, a couple of wallflowers. I felt like I was the cheerleader of the entire session, always making suggestions and trying to get us to move in a certain direction, or to try a certain song, or even sometimes suggesting who might sing the song. Neither Mark or Kurt really wanted to take the initiative to make a lot of decisions. It's funny now that everyone's calling the project the Jury, because no one else seemed to be all that excited about the idea at the time. Kurt really wanted to call it Lithium, It seemed as though Mark was satisfied with the name, but not necessarily excited about it. And I don't remember if Chris had an opinion one way or the other about it. But Kurt definitely did not want to call it the Jury. And the funny thing is, I don't really care for that name anymore. But it's a little too late for that. Who knows what we might have done if we'd been able to get together once a year for a couple of weeks. Lanigan and I have massive record collections, so there would have been a wealth of music for us to listen to learn from, research, and recreate. I really regret that it didn't happen. End quote. Here's the Jack Endino clip, guys. If you'd like to see the full interview with Jack Endino, the link is available below. You know, when people think of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, they often think of the MTV Unplugged version. But you actually recorded, from what I understand, the original one that Mark Lanigan and Kurt Cobain did together. Is this correct?
Correct.
And what was the story there exactly?
I may get this wrong because nobody has asked me about this for a long time. At some point, there was a session where Mark Lanigan and Mark Pickrell, the drummer from the Screaming Trees, and Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic were going to come in and record a side project that they'd been doing where they supposedly were writing some songs together. Now, they booked the time, and then apparently they never wrote any songs together. Or as Kurt said, well, we wrote some songs together, but we forgot them all. I don't know if it ever happened, actually. Mm-hmm. But he said, what we're going to do instead is we're just going to record some Lead Belly tunes. And I thought, okay. So they came in and recorded. And I think this is when that session took place. They recorded Where Did You Sleep Last Night? They recorded Ain't It a Shame, which is on the box set, and something called Grey Goose, which I had no memory of for years and years because it doesn't have a vocal. It's literally one riff over and over again. It's not very exciting. But there it was on the master tapes when we finally pulled it out. They just, for some reason, nobody bothered singing on it that day. And it ended up on the box set, I think. That was all they managed to do that day. One song with Mark singing, one song with Kurt singing, and an instrumental. And I asked them, what do I put on the log sheet? And they said, oh, call it The Jury. So, okay. So, but it wasn't really a band. But it was the only time I got to record Mark Pickrell drumming with Chris and Kurt. And I think that is where that version of Where Do You Sleep Last Night came from. Because sometime after that, when I was recording Mark Lanigan's first solo record, I think the subject of that song came up and we decided to just put that on the end of it. That's why that song is on the winding sheet. There's another song on the winding sheet called Down in the Dark, where we got Kurt to come in and do a backing vocal, and I'm doing a little electric guitar on it as well. Probably the only thing on which I'm playing guitar with Kurt singing that exists, which is interesting. I haven't really thought about that. Yes, but that was the version, that arrangement of the song, I think, is what inspired Kurt to do the song at the Unplugged session much later.
Really?
Probably so. Although really, Kurt was present when we recorded the Mark Lanigan version, so, I'm sure they arranged it together. Anyway, this is all speculation.
So, for you, when you listen to, I guess, the Unplugged version, how does it compared to the versions that you were involved with? Like, what do you think of it?
The arrangement is the same. The difference really is the instrumentation and the vocal. He sings it very similar to how Mark Lanigan sings it, but, he puts the sort of Kurt passion into it, really.
Yeah.
Different players, different instrumentation. I think the only thing in common is, Kurt's playing acoustic on it.